Podcast 11, Counterculture. Counterculture and its music. The 1960s counterculture is a demographic made up of the World War II baby boomers. These are kids that would have been born 1946, 7, 8, 9, that turned their early 20s at about 1966, 7, 8, 9. The 1960s counterculture movement shared a cynicism of the U.S. government and its leaders. This means they were highly critical and mistrustful of the United States government. They were anti-Vietnam War, as the United States was back at war with the communists. And it didn't help that the United States, in order to conduct the Vietnam War, instituted the draft. So, if you're 18, 19, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, you're a prime candidate to go fight an unpopular war. The situation in Vietnam has been a mess all the way back till 1954. This is when the Nationals, a liberation organization, defeated the French, who'd been occupying Vietnam for about 100 years. And so the Geneva Peace Accords, the peace treaty that resulted, divided the country at the 17th parallel, and the Vietnamese were allowed to hold free elections and to determine what their government would look like. But the United States, specifically the Secretary of State Dulles and President Dwight Eisenhower, did not support this war because they were concerned about the Vietnamese Communist Party organizing. So what they did is they set up the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is pronounced SEATO, which is a lot like NATO, but this is different because of the region that it's specifically designed to be applied to. And so under the auspices of SEATO, the United States was able to begin a nation-building process in South Vietnam. And they built the government of the Republic of South Vietnam. And during the election, the president was determined Nguyen Dinh Diem, and the actual election itself is considered to be highly suspicious of voter fraud and corruption. So now we have two major cities and two governments. In the south, we have the government of the Republic of South Vietnam, and we have the north, which the government hadn't formed yet. And so in comes the Communist Party, with the north largely open. The Communist Party comes in with the desire to unify North and South Vietnam into one country again. And so what they did is they formed the National Liberation Front. And Washington, for propagandic purposes, called this National Liberation Front the Viet Cong, which is slang for Vietnamese communist. When Kennedy was elected in 1961, he decided that it would be best to figure out what's going on over there. So he sent an exploratory committee to the region. And in December of 1961, what resulted are the White Papers. And in the White Papers, the exploratory committee determined that there were three possible ways to manage the South Vietnamese situation. Number one, they could boost economic and military support to the president, or they could try to crush the National Liberation Front in North Vietnam, or they could pull out and just leave it all alone. Well, they didn't pull it out. Instead, the situation escalated in South Vietnam. There were claims that Buddhist monks began harboring communists, and so the police conducted monk raids, and the Buddhist monks ultimately began to protest this in numbers. And so Kennedy knew that the government was going to have to be replaced, and so he supported a 1963 coup to overthrow the new president. So the South Vietnamese army captured Diem, and ultimately they killed him. And in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated as well. So that was pretty much the end of Kennedy having his hands in the pot. Now, in 1964, with the situation in Vietnam just getting increasingly worse, the United States conducted the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This was in reaction to the North Vietnamese attack on naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution changed the structure of presidential powers in terms of war and allowed the president to make decisions. And this is exactly one of the reasons why the United States is allowed to conduct itself without declaring war by the Congress. We can go to Afghanistan, for instance. And so the United States began conducting, just like in Iraq, an air war against the North Vietnamese. And this results in what's called a protracted war. There was no clear objective in what they were trying to do. They just simply began to try to destruct the country and render it ineffective for a potential assault on the South Vietnamese. But the North Vietnamese had an idea. They figured that if they just keep the United States in the war long enough, the North Vietnamese would eventually outlast them and the Communist Party could take over the country. Lyndon Johnson began to fight a war on two fronts now. He was fighting the North Vietnamese and he was fighting anti-war protesters back home in the United States. So he had an idea. If he could somehow limit the impact of the war at home, maybe people would not worry so much about this situation. And so by diminishing the impact of the war at home, the result, due to anti-war protests, was low volunteerism for the war. So what Johnson did is he instituted the draft. He reinstituted the draft. And by 1968, anti-war sentiment was rampant throughout the country. And as a matter of fact, an example of this is the 1968 police riot at the Chicago Democratic National Convention. If we remember the Republican National Convention here in St. Paul and the protests against the Republican National Convention, you remember this was just a few years ago when McCain and Palin were in St. Paul and how the riots were quite violent. Well, in 1968, the police went in and they had to shut these protesters down. And they did it in a very violent fashion. The Tet Offensive in, I believe it was 1967, was an organized attack from the North Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese against the South. And what they wanted to do is attempt to get Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining table because they felt that he would definitely cave. And they did without result in 1968. And so this was overwhelming for Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he did not seek re-election after his time as president. And now we bring in Richard Nixon. President Nixon had a secret plan. He decided that he would use South Vietnamese troops to fight the North and try to expand our forces that way. Now, the other part of this plan involved expanding the war to Laos and Cambodia, which is, according to international law, an illegal act of war. The idea was to draw the communists or the NLF into a thin column so that they could cut the supply lines off and eventually win the war. And he also intensified the air war to include the use of Agent Orange. In 1970, at Kent State, the famous Kent State story, there was a student protest was held, and National Guard shot 4 students. Finally, in 1972, Henry Kissinger negotiated a peace deal. This didn't hold up well in the South, and the North continued to attack the South, and eventually Saigon fell April 30th, 1975. The administration supported journalism in Vietnam, and the army and the armed forces went along with it because that's what they're told to do. And so pictures of the war coming back and being used as propaganda, that was another way that the counterculture was suspicious of the United States government. So if we can just shorten this up a little bit here, the conduct of the war in Vietnam by the U.S. government, the way that the government handled the protests, and these reasons are one of the big reasons why the counterculture mistrusted the United States government. The counterculture, however, was supportive of the civil rights and social justice movement that was going on in the United States. They rejected the attitudes and morals of mainstream America, and one of the mantras of the counterculture generation was tune in, turn on, and drop out. And this is a drug reference. Tune in to what's going on in the counterculture, use drugs, and drop out of the mainstream. This slide illustrates mainstream attitudes versus the counterculture perspective. Look at this. Etiquette and tradition, counterculture, aloof, they don't care. Attire, mainstream attire, suit and tie for men, conservative dress for women, counterculture, aloof. The concept of the American lifestyle or life cycle, to get married, have children, procreate, and move to the suburbs and buy appliances. They don't care about that. They're more into communal love and family and sharing, and the notion of free love, that sex and love is something that people simply share. In terms of religion, mainstream attitudes include the big Christian religions, whereas the counterculture were beginning to adopt perspectives of Eastern religions, or they were taking agnostic or atheistic point of views. In terms of politics, there was mainstream attitude to support the United States, whereas the countercultures were anti-war. The mainstream attitude towards America as the greatest nation versus counterculture, which takes on a more of a we are a one world type of attitude. The mainstream uses alcohol. The counterculture's alcohol was marijuana. And the mainstream music, pop, the counterculture music, rock and roll. And the counterculture was known for using a drug called LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide. This is a drug that was initially was produced by Sandoz Nutrition, which used to have a factory here, I believe, in St. Louis Park. Well, anyways, the people were experimenting, doctors and were experimenting with this drug and its effect in the 1960s because of the fact that it was illegal, or it was legal. However, in 1966, the state of California banned the drug, and eventually the United States did it as well. In 1971, the Drug Abuse Act pretty much sealed the deal on anyone ever experimenting with LSD for any purpose whatsoever, including for psychiatric patients. And Timothy Leary was, as I said before, kind of the spokesmodel for the use of LSD and the free dissemination of the drug. And he organized in 1967, during what's known as the Summer of Love, the Human Be-In, where hundreds of people dropped acid, and by dropped I mean that they took this drug. But that's the slang, is dropping. It's interesting here. You can see that LSD does have its place in rock history, in that a whole genre of music called acid rock formed to complement the effects of this drug. The capital of the counterculture was San Francisco, California, and specifically Haight Street, the Upper Haight, as it's called. There's the Upper Haight and the Lower Haight, because the Haight goes down a hill. You have the upper area and the lower area. So we have Upper and Lower Haight. And you can go there and you can walk from the Lower Haight all the way to the Upper Haight, or you can take a bus. But the Upper Haight is the location of the counterculture's epicenter. Specifically, the intersection of Haight and Ashbury Street. And you can go there, and there's all kinds of nostalgia, and the place, the buildings aren't any different, but you can really, kind of get a feel for what the culture is at the Haight-Ashbury location. This was also the location of the Grateful Dead house. This is where the band The Grateful Dead lived, and you could visit the Grateful Dead if you knew them, right there at Haight and Ashbury. And this area is also known for its free stores and clinics where you didn't need money. The counterculture movement, because money is a huge component of American culture, because dollars are a huge component of this culture, the counterculture, of course, rejects the concept of having to buy things or even make money in order to buy things. That's secondary to them. They would prefer to barter or trade. This is also the location of the Fillmore, which we'll get into a little bit later. Bill Graham was a concert promoter, and his club, called the Fillmore West, was known for its psychedelic artwork and light shows. And we'll go into the psychedelic in this term in a minute here. But this is where you could see really big counterculture acts such as the Grateful Dead, CCR, that is Creedence Clearwater Revival, Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, and Buffalo Springfield. We'll listen to some of that music in just a minute. Here's another one of Bill's places, Winterland, and you can see on the marquee outside, December 31st, the Grateful Dead, and you can see the Blues Brothers. But this is a picture of him taken outside one of his places. This is a picture of a concert promotion for one of Bill Graham's shows. This is considered to be psychedelic artwork. Now, in order to read this, you really have to look at the red and try not to look at the dark spots and let your eyes gravitate to them. If you look at the dark spots, it really looks like some sort of foreign language. But if you allow your eyes to just kind of relax, all of a sudden all the lettering will become quite apparent to you. And you should see in the curved part it says the Youngbloods. But this is an example of psychedelic art. The word psychedelic has an interesting etymology. Aldous Huxley, who was doing psychiatric experiments with LSD, came up with a name for the drug. He called it phanerothym. And he came up with a little saying: to make this mundane world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phanerothym. And he sent this to another doctor who was doing experiments as well, psychiatrist by the name of Humphrey Osmond. And Humphrey Osmond wrote him back and he said, no. It goes like this: to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And so that's where this word comes from. But the word refers to the access of the mind in a way that the mind hasn't been accessed before. And so they say that to have perceptions of reality that perhaps maybe include hallucinations, general changes of perception, synesthesia, and access of the mystical mind, and probably psychosis in the instance of what's known as a bad trip. That's what this term refers to. And so if you look at this slide again and you were able to see the young bloods and you're able to allow your eyes to relax, you had a psychedelic experience. And so that's kind of how this works. These psychedelic posters were very popular in San Francisco at the time. And here's another example, and you can see the big bubble letters and how they almost look distorted as if they're underwater. This is one of the common effects that LSD can give. It can make it seem as if what you see is underwater or distorted in some way. Here, this next slide is pretty trippy. Take a look at this. Notice that there are 3 eyes on the woman. We have the third eye being representative of the 6th sense of perception that one is supposed to be able to access under the influence of LSD, or as it's called, acid. 1967 was considered the summer of love in San Francisco, and this was the best of times and worst of times for this counterculture movement in San Francisco. And what happened was 100,000 hippies. Hippie comes from the word hipster, which is somebody who is in style, or which is ironic that we call them that. But anyway, the hippies flooded the Upper Haight and made one big happy, stoned, and tripped out family. But the result was overpopulation, sanitation problems, trash problems. And the original hippies and countercultures, by 1969, most of these people left, and many of them even formed communes out in rural California. And families lived together in clans. And if you go to Northern California, to Humboldt County specifically, you can see some of these places. But the hippies and the counterculture, they loved their rock and roll. And some of this music we refer to as acid rock. This is music that is as they might say in 1960s, best experienced in an altered state of psychedelia. Now, the style of acid rock does have some specific traits, and so we can create slides and memorize them. First of all, acid rock, when it comes to root genres, there's nothing specific. But generally speaking, we're going to have folk rock as a big influence because of the nature of the lyrics in folk rock. Country music and the blues, of course, the blues being a highly expressive form of music. Country music is an interesting one. We can hear the influence of country music more in the way the instruments are played, not so much the lyrics so much. Country music also because of the history of country music, and by country music I mean the simple people of Appalachia and their music. And then the notion of the free rambling country performer on the other type of country music, but really anything goes. One real difference in acid rock is the approach to the electric guitar. Pitch bending and distortion. Distortion occurs when the guitarist manipulates the amplification process in a way that causes the sound to sound fuzzy. And we'll hear examples of that. The use of the tremolo arm, specifically on a Fender Stratocaster, which is a type of guitar we looked at in our first podcast. The tremolo arm allows the guitar to be tuned higher and detuned to form lower, so guitars can create diving and soaring pitch. The use of a new device called the wah-wah pedal. Literally, when this pedal is used, and we'll hear examples of it, you'll hear this sound, wah-wah. That's what it sounds like, so that's what it's called. But acid rock in live performance will feature wandering long solos that just go on and on and on and on. This occurs for several reasons, perhaps. Number one, it provides an experience for the audience who may be using LSD. The guitarist may be using LSD, or the guitarist is lost and doesn't know exactly where they are in the chord progression. In terms of song structures, these songs will resemble rock and roll tunes. They'll have verses and choruses and bridges and chords and riffs and grooves and all those kinds of things. But where we really see a big difference is in the lyrics. The lyrics can be very vague or almost random. And the lyrics may include drug references. And the bands, especially the Grateful Dead, may go on long environmental improvisations. And what I mean by that is that there will be no backbeat. The drums may be used, but in a sound effect manner. The instruments are used to create sound effects, and these environmental improvisations are once again used to alter the perception of the audience. Let's take a look at some of the important bands of this counterculture movement. Most of these bands come out of California. First of all, the Grateful Dead. This band is thought of to be the band that represents every aspect of what this movement is about. The band lived together. They ate together. They took drugs together. But a Grateful Dead concert will feature long improvisations, and they will play cover tunes, but they'll also play original material. But at a Grateful Dead concert, what they do is they seem to float in and out of the different tunes. They'll play for 45 minutes straight, and maybe in those 45 minutes, material from 5 of the tunes will appear, but it will sort of evolve out of these long improvisations. You can listen to the Grateful Dead, and there's a lot of footage out there. But when you listen to a Grateful Dead album in the 70s, when they started to actually produce albums, the songs are very, very typical tunes, rock and roll tunes, with this influence of folk, blues, acid rock, country, space rock, as I said. Space rock being this environmental improvisation that I described before. But if you look at the members themselves, Jerry Garcia, the lead guitarist, has a folk background. Phil Lesh, the bass player, has a jazz and classical background. Bob Weir, rhythm guitarist, folk. Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart, notice that they have 2 drummers, with 2 drummers playing 2 drum sets and auxiliary percussion. The drum component, the percussion component of the music can be very interesting and quite complex, and at times even hypnotic. The famous keyboard Pigpen McKernan, who died, I believe, in 1971, was their keyboard player, and he's a blues player. And so this is the original lineup of the Grateful Dead. 5 members with diverse backgrounds. And this band, as I said before, this eclecticism, where genres may be elements of many different genres will be found in even one song. There are 3 tunes on the YouTube channel under psychedelic or psychedelia. I can't remember which it is. But the first one you should listen to is Saint Stephen. This is recorded live at Playboy After Dark in I believe, 1969. This gives you a really good idea about how they kind of fall into the song. The song, St. Stephen, will be very clear when it gets going, but you'll notice that Jerry Garcia, as he introduces the song, the guitar part is extremely random, and he plays notes that are nowhere near the key at times that the song is in, and it sounds very out of tune and very, very distorted. The next song you should listen to is the recording of Johnny B. Good live, and this is a good way to draw the connection between the Grateful Dead and music from the original rock and roll decade. This illustrates that their music is rock and roll. And then finally listen to Me and Bobby McGee, which was live in, I believe, 1971. This is a good example of how they're uncompromising when it comes to singing lyrics. Phil Lesh, Jerry Garcia has the really high, kind of almost whiny pitched voice that is very distinct in its characteristic sound. This example, you can hear how they how when they sing in harmony, but it's a harmony that only they can sing. It's a way that only the two of them can sing. The singing is not in key, but it's melodic at the same time, and this gives it their characteristic sound that they have. Our next California band is The Doors. The Doors got their name from a William Blake poem, and you probably can't read it because it's too small, but the line goes like this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to a man as it is, infinite. It's a very profound statement, but the idea of the doors of perception. This is a psychedelic term, and that it, considering the perception that the human mind can have at any given time. Anyway, the Doors got their name from this, and the lineup: Jim Morrison on vocals. I like to think of him as a poet as well. Ray Manzarek keyboards, Densmore on the drums, and Krieger on the guitar. The Doors' style is largely connected to the way that these 4 bandmates interact and write their own material. They get their lyrics from Jim Morrison. He's known for writing epic poetry, and you can see here that I describe his poetry as being an extension of beat poetry. This is where free association of words can be used to express ideas. Morrison's use of the voice is much different than Jerry Garcia. He can croon the audience, but he's also known for shouting and screaming and being absolutely imperceptible in his singing. Morrison was incredibly unpredictable, used profanity frequently, and sometimes would, to the distress of his bandmates, begin improvising lyrics that had nothing to do with the song. He's also known for his public displays of intoxication during performance as the band continued to be successful. And you can see that he died in 1971. He actually died in Paris due to a drug overdose. Manzarek's keyboard playing is quite distinct as well. He played a organ that was popular in the 1960s, and it's a portable organ, but it's kind of designed to sound a little bit like a Hammond organ, but it sounds nothing like the Hammond organ. It's that could be, I don't think that could be any more unclear. What I'm saying is that it's designed to be used in place of the Hammond organ. Now, on this organ, he has a series of keys that the left hand can play that will produce the sound of an electric bass. And so you can see that in the original lineup of the Doors, there's no bass player. And this is because Manzarek was able to play the bass lines on his organ. So his bass lines in the music of the Doors don't sound like a bass player, because the bass and the keyboard are two different instruments and they're played different ways. His bass playing, his left hand is absolutely steady, and he just simply plays notes that go along with the beat. And that leaves his right hand free to improvise on the keyboard and play chords. This is a distinct trait of the Doors, and when you listen to the examples, I think that you'll hear this, especially the video examples where you can actually see him playing with his left hand. Densmore's drumming complements the complexity of Manzarek's keyboard playing. He's, I like to say, easygoing. The parts are rarely difficult, and they fit the typical rock and roll genre. Krieger's guitar playing also complements Manzarek, and he tends to play in the background, but his lead guitar playing does have presence, and he's capable of extended improvisation, but it tends to be Manzarek that does the long improvisations. Their big hit was Light My Fire, which was, I believe, written and recorded in 66, but hit in 67, and spent for 3 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 100 chart. The original recording was 7 minutes in length, and they had to cut it to 2 and some change so that they could get radio play. A highly successful song still today, and the song is known for the lead keyboard introduction. And when the Doors performed on Ed Sullivan, remember the Beatles did this as well. It's kind of a rite of passage for a rock musician. But when they played the Ed Sullivan performance, one of the lyrics is, "Baby couldn't get much higher." And Ed said to Jim Morrison, he said, you can't say that on TV because it's obviously a drug reference. And Sullivan wouldn't have that. And the bandmates all agreed, okay, that's fine. But Jim Morrison had another plan. And when you listen to the recording of the Ed Sullivan performance, you'll notice that he blatantly attacks the word higher in such a way that he thumbs his notes at Ed Sullivan. They were never asked to come back and perform on the Ed Sullivan Show ever again. Here's 3 more hits by the Doors to listen to. 1967, People Are Strange. This was a single, did not appear on an album. This is an example of the Doors and how they fit into the acid rock category. Here, the song People Are Strange, it's a drug reference. People are strange when you're a stranger. And the lyrics are quite cleverly drafted to be a metaphor for being high or on acid. 1970 Roadhouse Blues. This appeared on Morrison Hotel. This is an example of hard rock and blues, which complements the music of the Yardbirds and of Cream. And this tune features Manzarek on piano. 1971 Riders in the Storm off the famous album L.A. Woman. Here we get the use of Manzarek's Fender Rhodes keyboard. Also the environmental sound of rain is used as well. So this is an example of each of these songs represents and is designed to represent the fact that the Doors were a very versatile band, and this comes from the fact that the players are versatile in these different styles, and Morrison's desire to constantly be reinventing the music. You don't need to memorize the lineup of Buffalo Springfield, but know that Buffalo Springfield had 3 very famous rock musicians, Neil Young, Stephen Stills, and Jim Messina. Neil Young, Stephen Stills, and David Crosby formed a band called Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And before that, just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But this is where Neil Young got his start. And their music really tends to be folk rock in its concept. It's protest music at times. The 1967 hit For What It's Worth, you've experienced that, I believe, on the study guide. But you can listen to it again. It's a very good example of the cynicism that counterculture had for United States government and authority. This is Janis Joplin. Notice that she died in 1970. Janis was a blues singer at heart. She's probably best known for her 1969 performance at Woodstock, which we'll talk about later. As I said, blues, she represents the absolute antithesis of what the girl groups out of the Brill Building were doing. You notice in the picture, there's two pictures here, that she's not dressed in a way that is typical for mainstream. She's uncompromising in her vocals. She's a high-powered singing and gives a very passionate stage presence. And the examples, listen to Piece of My Heart and Me and My Bobby McGee. Piece of My Heart will give you a very good idea about her passionate singing and her ability to absolutely command the vocal part of a blues tune. She improvises, and you just don't know what you're going to get when you perform with her. And so her band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, were able to work under these conditions. Jefferson Airplane, you have White Rabbit as the example on the channel. The vocals are very distinct from this band, as Grace Slick, the lead singer, has this ability to almost to give a theatrical performance where she's capable of being many characters. The lyrics are very clever, dark. The quality is psychedelic rock. The band began as Jefferson Airplane, but then as the 70s and the 80s rolled along, like the Beatles, they simplified Jefferson Starship. Of course, we'll talk about the 70s later and how everything was just bigger. 1980s, they dropped it and just called the band Starship. And Jimi Hendrix, the guitar blues virtuoso. In his early work, he worked like Duane Allman as a studio musician, like the Funk Brothers and Booker T and the MGs. Because he was reliable, he could lay down a recording, do it right the first time, and was gainfully employed initially that way. 1965, he went to the UK as the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and during this time, he developed a tendency to use guitar effects. The fuzz box, which is a distortion, distorts the sound of the guitar. Stereoscopics, using stereo sound, which is now available, the wah-wah, and we'll listen to an example of this to hear what this sounds like. And as I described, the tremolo arm. You can see here I've indicated that his contribution to rock history is virtuoso guitar playing, like had never been heard before until this time. At this point in history, he's definitely the best guitar player. Virtuoso is somebody who has absolute command of the instrument, but goes a step further in that when you watch them play, the guitar almost seems like it's an extension of his soul somehow. And the actual physical playing of the guitar seems almost irrelevant in the way that it's so easy for him to get over the instrument. There's never a moment where you think that, where you get the feeling that he's thinking about what he's doing. Rather, he's just simply doing. And he brought to the guitar the use of what I call extended techniques here. An extended technique is playing the instrument in a way that it was not necessarily intended for. For instance, if we take the piano as an example, this is probably the easiest way that you can visualize this. The piano is designed, you sit at it, you strike a key, you play the keyboard. An extended piano technique would be going inside and actually plucking the strings with your own fingers, or with an implement like a screw or a nail. Well, the extended techniques of Jimi Hendrix include the use of the wah-wah and the tremolo arm and the use of the pick on the strings in various ways. So he, until this point, no one had thought of playing the guitar quite like Jimi Hendrix did. Now listen to Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix. This is called Voodoo Child's Slight Return. It's off the album Electric Ladyland. Anyways, the opening of this, you'll hear the use of the wah-wah pedal. And you'll hear how when he begins to play the lead melody that you'll hear the pitch of the guitar shift and change as he uses his foot on the pedal. In the UK, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, and the Who were also cultivating a counterculture type of music. We've already discussed or read about the Rolling Stones here, so I'm going to try to get to the later 1960s part of this band. You can see here on the slide that in 1967 they put out an album called Their Satanic Majesty's Request, as a parody of Sgt. Pepper, perhaps. This album features acid rock, and it's quite it's quite distinct. And listen specifically to the song "She's a Rainbow," and when you do this, you'll almost notice that this is almost classical music, but it is this in this really distorted fashion. So this is an example of how they borrow a classical genre and elements of it, and then they apply that genre into this new context to perhaps, if you will, stimulate the mind in terms of its perception of what music is. In 1969, they adopted this logo as a representation of the band. It's their brand, for instance. And you can see that it's probably a woman's lips, and the teeth are there, and the tongue is kind of hanging out. It's a very sexually graphic image, and it represents this notion of rejection of the mainstream. Sticking your tongue out can mean all kinds of different things, and so this is what they did. But as they went on in history, the Rolling Stones are known for their movement away from acid rock, and they escaped this early 1960s genre of being part of the British invasion, and then through this acid rock, psychedelic rock, counterculture rock, as we've been talking about, and then later on they moved into and continued to follow the trend in music history, which was to go towards hard blues-based rock that was being cultivated in the UK by bands like Led Zeppelin. But it's amazing, their career. You can see 29 studio albums up to the point of when I made this slide, 10 live albums, 33 compilations, and 92 singles. And look at this legacy of the Rolling Stones. You can see consistently that they've had number one hit songs all the way back to 1965. And it seems like about every 2 years they come up with something that is spectacular enough to remain at number one. But what I find interesting about this is that their success drops off at 1981. And now the music festivals of the 1960s. The music festival was organized by a festival organizer, and I'm going to use Woodstock as an example of this, and I'll tell the story and you'll get an idea about how this works. But anyways, you should know the Monterey Pop Festival in California in 1967. this is where Jimi Hendrix gave a performance that was sexually provocative with his electric guitar. The famous 1969 Woodstock Music and Art Fair, 450,000 people estimated. The 1969 Altamont Freeway Speedway Free Festival in California, again turnout at 300,000. And look at this, Isle of Wight, UK, 1970 was practically a disaster, where 600,000 people descended upon this festival. And this is the story of Woodstock. Woodstock was the music and art festival that occurred on August 15th through 17th of 1969. You can see here the original poster for the event. It features the guitar neck, the dove, and the hand wrapped around the neck such that the thumb is draped over the lowest string. This is something that Jimi Hendrix could do. Not all guitarists can do this because of hand size. But it represents, the dove represents peace, and the guitar and the hand represent music, and so you can put the two together, peace through music. It says, an Aquarian exposition. Aquarius was the Greek goddess that is known for pouring the waters over the world of ancient Greece. She is beautiful, a sign of beauty and youth, and Zeus actually fell in love with her, and so the story goes. Let's learn a little bit about how it got started and what ultimately resulted from the event. The original concert promoters figured that they could pull off a music festival for about 150 to 200,000 people based on what had been accomplished in Monterey. And so they went looking for a site, and they found a unsuspecting farmer that was willing to lease his land, specifically an alfalfa field, in Bethel, New York. They were able to line up 32 acts and had the festival pretty well planned out. They did have to build a stage to accommodate the festival, but they did so in probably one of the best locations you could hope for, in that they had a natural amphitheater. In other words, a gently sloping bowl down to a level spot where they were able to build the stage, and then there's a beautiful lake behind the stage if you haven't seen it. They constructed very dangerous speaker towers, and everything seemed to look in the ups until 450 to 500,000 people showed up. As you can see on the slide, that's the population of Tucson, Arizona at the time, or Las Vegas. And because really 3 times the number of people showed up, they didn't plan for security for that, and so breakdown of law and order occurred. The fences they had constructed were toppled, and the crowds just simply flooded in. And so it became a logistical nightmare because so many people flocked to this event. Highways were closed, and they didn't plan for this number of people in terms of food and provisions. And so food, water, shelter, medical services, and sanitation were depleted. And the governor of the state of New York ultimately declared it a disaster area. So you would think that panic would ensue and people would leave the area, but they didn't. They stayed. No problem. And this is part of the hippie aesthetic, that through the community they will find the answers and everything will be all right. The story of how this all got started is a story of strange bedfellows. John Roberts and Joe Rosenman of New York City were stock traders. Anyways, there were a couple young guys that had made it pretty well, and they put an ad in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that stated, "Young men with unlimited capital looking for interesting, legitimate investment opportunities and business propositions." And so Michael Lang responded. Michael Lang was a head shop owner in the state of Florida, and he had some experience with promoting concerts. And Michael had actually put on a concert for about 15,000 people. So when it came to Woodstock, 10 times, going from 15,000 and multiplying by 10, why not? That sounds like a pretty good idea. You can see here, this is a picture of Michael on his motorcycle with his girlfriend on the right. Michael enlisted Brill Building songwriter Artie Kornfeld, who in 1963 was the vice president of Capitol Records. You can believe this, that he was 21 years old and a VP of a major record label. But that was the 60s. Anyway, Artie Kornfeld had connections in the music industry, and with Michael being the brainchild and Artie Kornfeld being the connection, these two guys initially worked out very well together. And so what they pitched was a for-profit venture, state-of-the-art recording studio in Woodstock, New York. And this is something that many musicians that had found some success were doing. They were starting recording studios. And in fact, Jimi Hendrix did this as well with Electric Ladyland Studio. And because the technology was changing so much, the recording studios and the big industry and the major labels, there were so many artists that were looking for recording studios that this makes sense. I mean, there's a market for a state-of-the-art recording studio. So you can probably see why Rosenman went for this idea. Also, recording studios that are away from the bustle and hustle of major cities. Major cities are a distraction for musicians because there's a scene, there's a lot going on, and having the studio being far away from the city allows for a retreat and for focus on recording. And this might be compared to Pachyderm Studios in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. It's far enough away from Minneapolis that one can go there and stay there and complete the project, or perhaps even Prince's studio in Chanhassen. But it didn't work out this way. The idea metamorphosized into a major concert event, as we described, for our 150 to 200,000 people. And so they went about looking for a location, and Woodstock wouldn't permit this. And so they went to the next community, which was East Bethel, where they were able to get a permit, much to the chagrin of many of the residents. But residents kind of fell on either side of the fence for this. Some of them thought it was a good idea because these young people would bring a certain amount of money to the community, and others just couldn't stand the hippies, and so they voiced loud opinions about it. But ultimately, the city granted the permit to hold the event. So as we said, this is a planned festival for 150,000 people, but they sold 186,000 tickets at $18 a piece. That makes for $3,348,000. They had an additional $1.5 million in gate sales, and they sold the rights to filming the event to Warner Brothers, for which Martin Scorsese actually directed the film project. And you can actually go and rent this from Netflix or from Blockbuster or buy it, and it's absolutely captivating filmography. And you can go to YouTube and watch excerpts of this as well. But Scorsese, in directing the film, made an effort to release it as quickly as possible. It's a historical film, and it was released in 1971, so very soon after the event happened. But you can see here that if you calculate for inflation, they made over $28 million, which is equivalent to the salary of Alex Rodriguez in 2008. But they still lost money because of the fact that they ended up having to rent helicopters to fly in the music acts because of the fact that the highways were closed. And so they had to fly in supplies, they had to fly in music acts. The only way to get in and out of the festival for logistical purposes was to use helicopters. And so this is extraordinarily expensive, and as a result, they came in way over budget. The first phase of the project was to construct the stage in the amphitheater, and they basically did this themselves, which is something you couldn't do today because of building codes. But they built this stage, and they built these speaker towers, and when the rains came on the second day, these speaker towers started to move back and forth, and they actually had to clear out an area because they were concerned that the speaker towers would collapse on the crowd, and there was nowhere for these people really to go because there were so many people. And so that caused a certain amount of contention. But once again, the hippie aesthetic, it's going to be okay. They survived. They got through this. But they did have a few scares. The fences that they built were totally inadequate for the crowds that arrived. And, of course, the crowds just simply toppled the fences, as I said. And as far as campgrounds go, they planned for 150,000. Well, when 450,000 show up, there's no place for these people to sleep. And so they ended up just sleeping in the mud. So here's a comparison chart. You can see how they were able to overcome the odds. Roads closed, acts stranded, they get helicopters. Okay, that's Michael Lang thinking on his feet. When the fans collapse the fences, Michael Lang declares it a free concert. Okay, no food, no deliveries. Well, the concert goers shared with each other. They stretched out their provisions and were able to get through the 3 days. When the rains came and the mud became unbearable because the foot traffic had absolutely destroyed the alfalfa field, people celebrated and wallowed in the mud. Without showers or adequate baths, people went to the lake and simply skinny dipped. When there was a bad acid scare, this is when the LSD is flawed, which will produce a bad trip or make you very sick. They used the PA system and gave a public announcement to watch out for the bad acid or the brown acid. Once again, when the campgrounds were crowded, the fans simply shared their space and in a communal effort to make accommodations for all that arrived. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair was a historical event, as it was the largest gathering to the date of humans in the United States. The concert promoters Michael Lang and Arnie Kornfeld conducted it in a nonviolent fashion. They were able to keep the crowd under control simply by using the microphone and reporting to the crowd the conditions on the ground, and they kept communication going this way. The aftermath of the event yielded an enormous pile of trash and a completely destroyed alfalfa field. And some would argue that this was an exercise in total narcissism. I like to think of Woodstock as the conclusion of the 1960s decade. Within just a few short years of 1969, Jimi Hendrix was dead and Janis Joplin was dead. A lot of the bands had broken up. Many of these musicians were addicted to drugs, and really the end of the 1960s and the hard lifestyle of the hippie aesthetic really collapsed in 1969. In 1970, the Vietnam War continued to grind on, and it seemed like there was no end in sight. And the hippie culture seemed to darken, and pop music began to change. And you can read about what Kovacs says about 1970s and how many authors choose to reject 1970s rock and roll because of its influence, because of the influence of the music industry on it, and the free-spirited protest music and counterculture music came to an end and yielded to the big music industry and what they would record and what they would not record and sell. So that aside, the music still goes on. Rock and roll still lives on. And so we go on to the 1970s and begin to examine music by bands like Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith and other heavier blues and metal rockers.